Welcome to the Surviving Siblings podcast. I'm your host, Maya Roffler. As a surviving sibling myself, I knew that I wanted to share my story, my brother's story. I lost my brother to a homicide in November 2016. And after going through this experience, I knew that I wanted to share my story and his story. And it's taken me quite some time to come to the mic to tell it, but I knew it was an important one to tell. So here I am to share his story and mine with you. And it's important that I tell the story of the surviving sibling, the forgotten mourner, the story that is not told enough. So thank you for coming with me on this journey, and thank you for listening to my story. The grief journey did continue for me, but here comes the pandemic, 2020, as I'm going into the 4th year of the loss of my brother. And this shifted the entire world. This changed everything for all of us. And I can't say that it really put grief in the back seat for me, but it's really put a different perspective on grief for me. I was forced to sit alone with my thoughts a whole lot more. So it did push me into a unique time in my grief journey. I did feel like I regressed a little bit. I had felt like I was coming out of this time of feeling like I had failed my brother, and I was still feeling like, I failed him. This guy's not behind bars. There's no justice. I'm fighting alone. There's no army with me. I'm this lone warrior. Maybe I have this ally across the ocean, my father, but I don't really know. And the pandemic hits. And my main source of income was working this is the very last company I worked for. I was working for an events company, a boutique events company. I ended up getting very ill. I was traveling for almost 2 weeks. And this was in February of 2020. And I got COVID before we were really talking about what COVID was. And I thought I was going to die. I really did. And if you guys have had COVID or have seen someone with COVID to this level, I have a pre-existing condition. I have asthma, which is not crazy bad. Some people have things that are tremendously worse, of course, but that's why it hit me. And I've been out in Vegas and then in California, and I flew, I think, through Utah. And so it hit me bad. And I finally made it back home, and I was sick for a month. And I was really stuck alone with my thoughts during that time. And I don't do well when I just have to sit still. I'm not that kind of person, which if you follow me and you've been following my story and you follow who I am in my personal life and my business life, I don't just do one thing. So having to just sit still, and then the pandemic hits as I'm getting better. So I'm reflecting a lot on things and just, oh God, I missed him so much during that time. And I miss him every day, but it was just a lot. And I felt every emotion again. And when you on your grief journey are there and you're alone with your thoughts, and you really have to sit with your grief, and you really have to sit with what has happened, and also you're reflecting back on 3.5 years at that moment in time. It's a lot to unpack, and I've shared that journey with you here, and I was going through so many emotions, and I felt like hell. So I was like, oh my gosh, just take me. I really wanted to die. I really didn't want to live because I felt so sick. I felt like I had failed my brother. I was really on a low. I really was on a low. And then when the pandemic really truly hit, I was on a low as well, because I'm an exceptionally extroverted person and the whole world shut down. And then my business, I work in the event space, or at least that was my predominant source of income at the time. And my husband, he's my husband by then, yes, he is a chef. And so we were both really going through it professionally. And we were both very lucky to still have our jobs. But I went through this awakening of I wanted to take back my own kind of destiny and control. And so I ended up going out on my own finally. So I went back to like circa 2017 when I wasn't really stable enough after the loss of my brother, when I was trying to go out on my own and consult and grow a business and, started my first podcast and was trying to build a brand. And I was like, no, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this for real. And people thought I was nuts. I mean, even the woman I was working for, but she was furloughing people. I was getting partially furloughed. And, even still at my level, like that's, I was still doing well. It was fine. And my husband still had a job because of the level that he was at and as an executive chef. But it was hard times. And I'm like, you know what? If I'm ever going to take a risk, I truly felt like I was talking to my brother a whole lot at the time, and this is something I recommend too, like talk to your loved ones, like that have passed to the other side, like they will guide you. My brother, when I was really sick, he came through in a lot of dreams, and he still will come through when I have questions. And that was really his way of always speaking to me, was coming through in dream. And we'll share a little more about how he comes through in dreams in just a minute, but I just felt this push, kind of like how I felt pushed to go on those trips right after his passing when I really didn't want to. I felt pushed. I just felt this push. And I was very lucky that my husband was so supportive. Not that I wouldn't do things on my own because I'm very strong-willed. But when you're married, things change. You want to have a partner that supports you, and you want to be a team. And he believes in me, and this makes me emotional, but my brother was always someone who believed in me, and I felt like it was almost like a channeling there. It was like, wow. And so I did this. I went out on my own in the pandemic, and it was nuts because you're going to go out and do event stuff on your own. In the event industry, in a pandemic, events were shut down. The world was shut down. So I learned everything possible about virtual events and just went for it. And it was really hard. It was hard. But I felt like I was really doing this as a testament to my brother. And little did I realize this was the beginning of something much bigger, because I'm sitting here talking to you guys. And I don't think if I hadn't done that exactly 2 years ago, I don't know if I'd be sitting here talking to you right now. It might have taken me longer, but my brother was that way. He just took risks. He was an entrepreneur in the making. He had a ways to go. I love you, Andreas, but you did. But he wanted that. He always wanted that independence. He never really wanted to work for anyone else. And we did have that in common. We really did have that in common. And so it was tough. It was really tough. So I was dealing with that in 2020. But then there was a lot of things that we all were dealing with the pandemic. And then depending on where you were in the country, I live in Atlanta, so we were in the heart of a lot of the riots and things that were happening over the summer. My husband was dealing with so many things, being at the level that he was at and having to let so many people go. It was a tremendous amount of stress, and that was something for me that, even though it was stressful, I know now that it was a way in the beginning, and I was paving a way to build my life and my destiny towards honoring my brother. And I didn't even realize it just by building a small event consulting firm. That was the beginning, this little baby egg of it. And it started back in 2017, but then I, got these, opportunities to go elsewhere, and I wasn't ready. So I thought, we'll never know. This is a part of my journey. This is a part of my story, and this is a part of my grief story, and this is a part of being a surviving sibling. There's the ebbs and the flows, and there's the lows and the hopes. And 2017 was so low for me, as I've expressed in the previous episodes, and I just am grateful that I love that I did that, and I'm not afraid to share my failures, and I'm not afraid to share the fact that I've fallen on my face and made so many mistakes, because I also did in 2020, but I ended up having one of the best years ever in 2020, which most people did not. And I didn't tell people that until really recently, because I almost felt like ashamed to, because so many people struggled. But I know that that was because I was doing this kind of not just only for myself, but I now realize this is a part of something so much bigger. I was building and teaching myself how to build things and go forward and be even more self-sufficient, if that was possible, but build these businesses. And so that was the start of it. But it was hard. I was mentally and emotionally not doing very well because of my extrovertedness and having to be in the home all the time and having to really sit and rethink all of these things. And at this point, for private investigator, like, not like, I tried to, meet with them again, and like, just to even get one, I mean, it was like 20 grand. It was insane because the case had gone on for so long. The files were so crazy. I mean, that was like, I had depleted resources at this point. I was starting a business. It was so tough. I was losing hope. So that side of the kind of the spectrum, that was like definitely not a flow. It was like an ebb. It was not, I was losing the hope there on that. That was a down. That was not a hope. The hope was the entrepreneur side of things. And you've got to be grateful for the hope and, kind of accept the down moments and just kind of lean into them. And I felt very defeated again. But and you've got to be really careful too, because if you're going through a situation like mine, there are people that will try to take advantage of you, and you've got to really trust your gut and trust your guide, which I believe are our loved ones that have passed on the other side. And, I didn't feel like these people were the best always. So, I continued to write to local council and try to have people help me, and I still pounded the pavement, but there's only so much you can do when you're in a pandemic and government shut down. And so I felt like I was in this kind of holding pattern again. And it was tough. And you kind of have to put your, I don't want to say emotions on hold, but like you kind of have to put yourself in a holding pattern. And it's so frustrating because you're like feeling like you failed this person. Let alone you're still grieving. You're still grieving. And you don't have any closure, quote unquote. This is a big thing. People think like you need closure. And that's what I was seeking. I was seeking closure. I was seeking justice. I was seeking all of these things. And I was kind of going crazy, to a certain extent. And life goes on. Whether you're going crazy, whether you're grieving, and that's so hard to hear. And I want to smack people, like, when they say that. Like, I want to smack them when they're like, life goes on. Okay, that's like in the top 10 worst things, which I'll do a post, or maybe I'll talk about that on the podcast at some point, but top 10 worst things to like say to someone. Life goes on. Well, yeah, no crap, it goes on. Like, life, yes, it goes on, but my point in saying it is, yes, life is moving on. That's why it is so hard. Like, there's a secondary part of my statement. Life is still moving, and you feel like you're not. Like, you're frozen in bed some days. You're sometimes having to get out of bed and go to work, and you feel like a zombie. And, like, I'm sure you've felt this way, or maybe you feel this way right now as a surviving sibling. Like, how is this life even real? And yes, I still was going through those emotions in 2020. And my husband and I were renovating our condo. We had bought a new build home, and we're finishing that out. We moved into that. So there's just a lot going on, and here I am doing this business. I mean, I was totally nuts. And I think there was a part of me that was kind of putting a lot on myself too, to distract myself. And I had, really thrown myself into this relaunch of my other podcast, which is a leadership podcast for women, and was building a brand off of that, which is what helped me create this podcast that I hope is helping you. And, it was all part of this journey, but it was a lot. I put a lot on myself, and I was really exhausted, and I was having some emotional breakdowns, and it was tough. It was really tough. And I always struggle in September as well as November. November is, of course, the death date of my brother. He was officially declared dead. He was shot on November 19th, but he was officially declared dead on November 21st. So that's when Andreas that's his death date, or his death anniversary, or death, we have many names for it, right, as surviving siblings. But Andreas and I shared a birthday, which I've shared in previous episodes, but sometimes I'll repeat some things just in case you're tuning in at different times. But Andreas and I shared the same birthday. We were not twins. We were 3 years apart, but we had the same due date. We were both 2 weeks late, and we both weighed the same, and we have the same birthday, which is the 21st of September. It's also odd that he died on the 21st. So the 21st is a significant number for me. And I also am into numerology and things like that too. And the number 3 is a very special number and things like that. So it's a whole other thing to talk about. But September is a hard month for me because we shared this birthday together. And as kids, you kind of go through, again, the ebbs and flows of life. And there were times that we thought it was so cool, and then we hated it, and then of course as adults we thought it was really cool that we had the same birthday. And then of course same due date, 2 weeks late, that's crazy. Mom, Dad, what were you guys doing, right? No, I think it was way deeper than that. I think that we were very, very deeply connected, and I would find that out later as I traveled down more of a spiritual path, which I'm going to share with you, but which came up in 2021. So I was really struggling in September of 2020. I went back into a depression. I really did. I was struggling with just even though I was doing well, I was struggling with my business. It was hard. I was struggling with the fact that you couldn't be around people still. It was still pretty closed off in the world. Couldn't travel, this is first world problems, but I always traveled for work, and I wasn't traveling for work, and I couldn't even travel somewhere random for my birthday. I couldn't even go to I don't know, somewhere for my birthday. I didn't even care where it was. That's just who I was, and so I was really having a hard time. And I was just sitting in bed one Sunday. And of course my husband's working, chefs work these crazy hours. He's, typically working on weekends. He'd have either Monday, Tuesday off or something like that. It was hard during the pandemic though, because it was typically one day, if even that, because of the staffing. But I was sitting there in bed Sunday with my dogs, and I think I was drinking a mimosa, trying to have these self-care was so big during the pandemic, and I still think self-care is big, but I think we need to change the narrative on self-care. I think we need to talk about, it's not just sitting in bed having a mimosa, right? It's also listening to a podcast like this and connecting with people, and self-care for me is answering your messages. So if you ever want to chat or something, send me a message on my website or whatever. I love talking. That self-care for me is giving back, sleeping, resting. A bubble bath isn't really self-care for me. It might be for you. Whatever self-care is for you, going for a walk, I think we need to change the narrative on self-care. Going and getting a mani and pedi, that's a necessity for me. That's not I need to look good for my job. I actually don't find that to be self-care. So let's normalize that. Just saying. And as a surviving sibling, as someone who's gone through grief and is still grieving and will grieve for the rest of my life, I want you to know that that's normal. And some people may find those things to be self-care. I don't. Sitting with my dogs and hugging them and, watching a movie that reminds me of my brother, or happy times or things like that, that's self-care for me. Actually forcing myself in a positive way to do nothing and enjoy a book or connect with a person or be in the moment, that's self-care. So that's my little preach there for you. And hopefully that makes sense, because we need to change the narrative on that. I really think so. But I was doing some self-care, so I thought at the time, and I think it was, because this was interesting. So I'm sitting there with a little mimosa or whatever I was drinking, and with my dogs in our new home, and I was kind of stressed because we had the condo still. I was trying to decide, like, we put it up for sale, I think, at that time, and I was trying to figure out, do we rent it, do we not, like, do we keep it, because I invest in real estate too, and it was just a whole thing at the time, and I was like, no, I need to unplug, just like I was talking about. So for some reason, this is not typically me, I'm like, I'm gonna watch First 48. This is not a show that I typically watch, but it was like randomly my TV turned that on. Like, we're not big like cable people typically. We're typically like the Netflix people or like Peacock and all that stuff, right? When we watch TV. But it was randomly like on that channel because we have it like on our TV just there. So it was on this cop show, First 48. And it caught my attention because it was Atlanta. And I'm like, okay, this is a little weird. Maybe this will make me check out a little bit. I'll watch this. I am not kidding you. I start watching this. This is early September. First week of September. And I'm like shaking telling you about this. And I'm watching it, and I'm like getting into the episode. I'm like, this is really wild. It's always about homicide and things like that. And I recognize a lot of the areas. I live in the city. And I'm watching this detective on there, and he's just like, he's tugging at my heart, you guys, like really tugging at my heart, and I'm really connecting with him. And I'm like, who is this guy? And we're going to call him Detective G. That's not his name, but we'll get to why we're going to call him that. But Detective G I'm watching him on TV, and I'm just like, wow. And I get into like episode 2 or 3, and I'm like so like just compelled by him, by the way he is handling the cases. He's so enthralled and determined for justice, but it's how he handles the families, how he was speaking to the moms especially, and then also I saw an episode with siblings, and I started just crying. Like, I'm crying right now telling you about this. I was so moved by this detective, and I'm seeing him all over these places, very close to where my brother was shot. And I'm like, this is so weird. And so I continue to watch, and it must have been the 3rd or 4th episode, and lo and behold, Dirty Detective, they show a scene where Detective G is in the office with Dirty Detective, and he is on one of the episodes. My heart, that feeling where your heart like sinks into your stomach and you feel like you're going to throw it up? That's what happened. I couldn't believe it. My jaw dropped. I shot up in bed. I started texting my husband. I was like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And he didn't always respond right away when he was in that role, because he was like, he had laid off like so many people. It was a terrible situation. And so I was like, oh my God. And I think I'm like glued to the TV at this point. And I'm watching more. I think I got through, I don't know how many more episodes. And I'm like, I'm going to find this man. Not Dirty Detective, but this detective. I'm like, I'm going to find him. I'm like, how am I going to find him? I'm like, it's a Sunday. How am I going to find him? I'm like, I'm going to go on social media. I'm going to hit Instagram. I'm going to hit Facebook. I'm going to hit every demographic. I'm going to hit Twitter. I'm going to hit, I don't think he's going to be on TikTok because, like, I'm just figuring out TikTok, and I think he's older than me, so I'm not going to hit there. So I hit, and LinkedIn. So I hit 4. And I wrote him my story. And I said, look, I'm watching you on the show. I was like, I'm so touched by your stories and how your experience. And I like wrote this heartfelt message, as long as, it would allow me on there, on where I could find him. And I just put my phone down, and I was like, took a sip of my little mimosa, and went back to watching the show and went back to watching him. And I was just like glued to this Detective G. And wouldn't you know, I don't even think it was 2 hours. He wrote me back. He wrote me back on Twitter, and he said, "Hey Maya," he's like, "I'm in the mountains right now with my family." And he said, can you, I basically, long with the short, he'd like to help me. Can you tell me more about your case? Like, who was your detective? All of that information, blah, 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 because I didn't tell him at the time. And before I could even write him back, because I didn't know he had messaged me yet, I didn't get the notification right away because I don't keep all my notifications on. They'd be going crazy. He said, "Never mind, I found it," and he named the dirty detective's name. He goes, "When I get back to the city," he goes, "I'll open your file," and he goes, "I will give you an update." And so I gave him my information, and I thanked him like a million times, and I was freaking out, and I ended up calling my husband. I'm like, oh my God, you're never gonna believe this. And I tell him the story just like I'm telling you, and he's like, "Oh my God, that's crazy." He's like, "You don't watch stuff like that?" I'm like, no, I'll watch Snapped and murder shows and stuff like that, which is weird probably, but I don't watch these like cop shows because to me, these cop shows are a little closer to like what I'm actually going through, which again might not sound connectable to you, I don't know, or maybe that makes total sense to you, but like I'm actually going through this right now, so I can't like watch those typically, and for some reason that day I did. Sure enough, he gets back to the city. He calls me first thing Tuesday when he's back. First thing. And he is incredible. And the reason I call him Detective G is because, one, I don't want to unveil his identity. Some of you may figure it out. He's on First 48 all the time. He's an absolutely incredible man. But he actually calls me. And he's like, "Maya." I'm like, "Yes." He's like, "This is Detective G." Is what we're calling him. And I'm like, "Oh my God." I'm like, "Hi." And he's like, "Do you have some time to talk?" And fortunately I did, because, I'm working for myself. And I'm like, "Yeah." And he's like, "Look, I pulled out the case." He's like, "This is really, this is a lot." And he goes through the entire case with me that I've shared with you guys already. And I'm like, "Yes, I'm aware." He's like, "It looks like the previous, dirty detective was on this." And I'm like, "What has been going on though?" I said, "Can I ask?" Because like I've called him, and he tells me that this particular gentleman, dirty detective, was actually promoted, and just, that was it. And I was like, "But I called him, and he was like, "Yeah, it was like, I think it had been almost 2 years since his like things, and that's why the phone had stopped." And I was like, "Well, why wouldn't anybody tell me? Like, why would this just," he like, "I don't know." He's like, "I'm so sorry, I don't know. I have no idea." I'm like, "Okay, like, well, what do I do? What happens?" And he's like, "Well," I'm like, "What happened? Like, did the bullet from my, again, trigger warning here, guys, if this is too graphic for you, I'm going to talk about the bullets and stuff. But I said, "Did the bullet from my brother's, brain where it was lodged in," I said, "did that ever get matched to the, 2 guns that were identified? Did any of that happen with forensics? It was so backed up." He kept giving me the runaround. "Did you guys ever get the final interviews?" I asked all these questions, and he obliged, and he said, "You know what?" He goes, I'm gonna get the gun out of evidence, because I'm seeing in the report it was the smaller gun. Guys, like I said, I knew it was that one. It wasn't this shotgun ricochet story that these guys had concocted. It was the smaller gun. So that gave me chills right away. I was like, oh my God. Like, it makes me emotional to this day. He's like, "I'm going to get that out of evidence. We still have it." I said, "Okay." He goes, "I'm going to make sure forensics takes the bullet and goes over there and it gets done. We make sure this happens." I'm like, oh my God. I had to hold it together, because I felt like, oh my God, like, this is happening. This is finally happening. Like, something is finally happening. And I couldn't thank him enough. He's like, "Look, I can't make you any promises." He's like, "This is really tough." He's like, "Really, really tough." And I was like, "What is this case considered?" I said, "This is really hard for me to ask, but what is this case considered? Because, it's almost 4 years." And he said, "Yeah, unfortunately," he said, "this case is considered closed." And I cried. That was really hard for me to hear. And I asked him, why? And he said, I don't know because this wasn't my case. He's like, let me look at it some more. Let me get this stuff out of evidence. He said, and he goes, and I'll tell you, my professional opinion and how I would have charged this case and how I would have handled it. He's like, there's a statute of limitations of 2 years, which I knew about, which is why I was so adamant about going after this and getting the paperwork, and why I felt like in 2019 that I had failed my brother, and just so many things were going on with me. But I also know different things can happen. Things can get reopened, things can happen, miracles happen, things change. But hearing that from him was hard. And I said, how did this case get closed? I said, how did this happen? We never went to court. We never heard anything. He said, it looks like based on this file that Detective Dirty, as I call him, basically dismissed it and let this guy go because he turned over the guns and wrote it off as an accident. And I was like, what? And he's like, yeah. He's like, well, it looks like that based on the file because he came in, he admitted it and turned over the guns and he didn't have a record. I have never felt so sick in my life because 1, I was right about everything. 2, I know it was not an accident. Detective G did not believe or allude to that either, although professionally he can't say that. But he said, let me, before we go even deeper into this, he goes, let me do a full analysis of the file. I said, okay. It was hard to hear that though. And so he hung up and he did everything he said that he would do. He got the gun right out of evidence. He finally got that bullet analyzed. Shocker, guys. They matched. The gun was registered to that gentleman. He could have come back and gotten that gun at any time too because he wasn't charged, and he never did. Interesting, right? Interesting. I think someone who's not guilty would come back and collect their items. Interesting. It took about a week or so. It was before my birthday and my brother's birthday. He called me back. And he had a long conversation with me. And he would text me updates as well. I'm telling you, this man was another angel in my life. And it was the best birthday present I ever could have gotten. And he said to me, okay, I'm going to give you the whole scope here. And I said, okay. I said, I'm ready. And he basically told me a lot of what I had already told you. They couldn't really charge him with anything because he didn't have priors. That was one thing. I was like, what? He goes, look, he's like, that would not have been my decision. I'm reading the file to you. He goes, but I am telling you. He goes, the bullet and the gun match. He did kill your brother. It was a lot to hear that. And it was also a lot to hear that I was right. It was not this shotgun that was shot off accidentally and ricocheted and hit my brother in the face. No, it was the small handheld gun that did hit my brother and kill him, and I was right. So, if you think something is wrong about a situation, I'm going to side note this for a second to you as a surviving sibling. If you think something is wrong about this story, or you believe that you know what happened, or you think in your gut, trust it because you're right. I'm telling you right now, you're right. You know the truth. You know the truth already. That is your sibling. That is your connection. That is a part of your soul. You came out of the same people, and even if you're not blood related, you're soul related. If this is like a soul sibling, you are connected. Trust your gut. I was right. And I spent 4 freaking years questioning myself. And I thank God for Detective G every single day. And he went on to tell me that, because he turned over the guns and because he admitted it, Detective Dirty, I guess, he had the power, I guess also with his promotion, And there's just so many cases that he decided to just throw it out because the most they could have charged him with was manslaughter. And, most of those guys get out after 2 to 4 years. Tops. So he may have served a couple months. And I needed a moment after that. And, Detective G said, look, I'm going to keep an eye on this guy. He said, I am. And I believe him. And he's like, you can call me whenever you want. We talked for a long time about everything, about all the details, about the gun, about a lot of things that, would probably bore you guys to death to listen to. And if you ever wanted to talk to me about it or talk more about it, I can talk about it. But because it's considered quote unquote closed, which doesn't mean, there's still perhaps not justice to be served for him. But, I do believe things come to people who do terrible things. But the part of the conversation that was more important was that, this man was like, look, I've been doing this for almost 25 years. And this is really hard. And then he goes, look, I don't know. This wasn't my case, so I don't really know what happened. All I can do is look at the facts here. He's like, it doesn't look good. He goes, it looks really weird. And he said that to me. It looks weird. And he goes, it's a homicide case. He's like, it's on his death certificate. It's a homicide. He was killed. He was murdered. Whether it was an accident or not, he goes, I can't say that, prove it, disprove it, because, the detective dirty, as I have to call these nicknames to bring some, levity to it, because it angers me that someone would do this and just not care about a life like this. But he said, Maya, he goes, I have to tell you something. He's like, couple of things. He goes, for the record, had this been my case, he goes, this man would have been charged. He goes, I would have gone for whatever the maximum I could get, even if it was the manslaughter. He goes, he would have been charged. There's no way I would not have charged him. So I am so sorry that this happened. I can't tell you guys how much that meant to me. Just to hear that from someone, to know that my brother had injustice, to know that someone that is, not someone that aired one time on this show, but someone who is consistently on a reputable show and is a good person and cared enough. I'm sure this man is so busy with cases. He took the time to text me and call me and stay in touch with me, and he's still available if I want to speak to him to this day. What does that say about him versus the other person? And what he said, I take as truth. I take that as truth. And so for him to say that, I said, I appreciate that. He goes, if this was my brother, I would want to hear that and I would want to know that. And he goes, and I treat every case like it's my brother, my sister, my mother, my friend, all of that. And I knew that just watching him on TV. And I will tell you, this is not always TV, guys, because I shared with you in previous episodes, I've been on TV and it's not all real. He's real. He's the real deal. And so, you could probably figure out who he is. But I call him Dr. G or Detective G. I'm calling him Dr. G right now because I feel like he's giving me therapy. He's Detective G, though, because he's Detective Good. Detective Great. He was incredible and is an incredible person. He's a beautiful family man. And I'm telling you this because there are good cops out there and there are some really dirty ones. And you have to just trust your gut and know. But just when you thought this couldn't get better, it did. I mean, this is a horrible situation. And there was a lot of beauty to it. Because he gave me so many gifts. He gave me, all this information that I've been searching for and fighting for. And I was so tired. And, here I was struggling through a pandemic just like all of us. And grieving. It's a horrible situation. And he just spent time talking to me. It was a long conversation, this conversation. And he shared a couple other details, about him. He made sure he looked through the records of, this guy and, wanted to make sure I felt safe. And I shared some of the other people and, he looked into all this. He wanted me to be safe. I was just blown away. But, I told him this was the most poignant part, I think, of the conversation, besides getting the information and, just knowing that this was done wrong and that justice should have been served for my brother, and that had a real, true detective like him been on the case, someone not just looking to slide these cases off his plate so he could get promoted, but someone actually going after justice, would have charged this man, because he did murder my brother, and I was right the whole time. Just when I thought I had gotten so much and enough to just feel like, okay, I did fight. I did do something for my brother. I said to him, Detective G, I said, I don't know what it is. I've been fighting for, almost 4 years now, and, I guess I was just looking for closure or something, or I don't know what it is that we're looking for. It's been my journey with this. And he said, you know what, Maya? I said, I've been doing this for, I think he said almost 25 years at that point. I'm sure it is now, around there. And he said, can I tell you something? And I said, of course, anything, of course. And he said, I don't think there is such a thing as closure. And I was like, what do you mean? He said, I don't believe that closure exists. I only believe in answers. And I just sat there, you guys. And it blew my mind. Because he was right. And he is right. And I said, Detective G, oh my God. I said, thank you for that. And he said, look, I've done it a long time. He goes, I've had to tell, moms, sisters, brothers, mothers, fathers, sisters, grandmas, everybody, and he's like, it's not closure that happens. It's the answers. And when people get the answers that they are needing, they come to a place where they can, it's not really about also, we elaborated and continue to talk a little bit. It's not really about, quote unquote, like moving on, like forgetting about the person, but they're able to say, okay, I know now. And they can accept, and it's still not okay, it's still not right, but like, it's the unknowing. It's not having the answers. It's not about closure. You're never going to have there's no such thing as closure. There's only answers. That was the most powerful thing anybody has said to me in this entire grief journey. And it came from someone who sat like a desk away from the person who was like basically not giving justice for my brother. It's so crazy in life how that can happen. And I thanked him a million times, and he said, if you ever need anything, if you ever need me to go dig up anything, if you ever think anything is different, he goes, I can help you with it. And he goes, but unfortunately, this is where this case is, but you need to know I would have charged him, and I would have given him the maximum, and this is what would have happened, and you would have deserved that, and you do deserve that as his sister, and he deserved that, and I'm so sorry. That was the best gift anybody could have given me. And I hope that he is giving you a gift too by me sharing this, because I think we all deserve the answers. And I think it's really important. Like, he gave me permission to not feel the pressure of having to have this closure, of having to, okay, by 2 years I've got to have it together, by 4 years, by 5 years, by 10 years, no, there's no such thing as closure. There's answers. And it truly gave me a sense of like, okay, there was injustice. He was murdered. This is the truth. I can fill in the blanks from here. I'm not okay with what happened, but I thank God for this man, and I know my brother led me to that TV that day. That was just way too weird. It was way too bizarre. And that really carried me through 2020 and my ability to, do my grieving and really know and accept what happened, but accept it in a way knowing that people knew that there was an injustice that happened, because I wasn't forced to do like this closure. I wasn't, I didn't feel like I had to have closure in my life. No, it's okay. I can tell my story. I can talk about it. And I even opened up and did my first interview in 2020 and talked about my brother's death, which was so hard. And looking back on that girl now, she'd be so proud of me sitting here talking about this right now. I got on, like a video and talked about, like a video interview, video podcast, and talked about my brother's death for the first time openly with the public. And I look back at that 2020 Maya and I'm like, thank you so much. He will never know what that did for me and how that changed my life in this grief journey, and how I think that will change also my family's life, because they don't know that information. And I hope that one day I'm able to share that with them. I hope one day that it will help them in their grieving journey and their healing journey. And I really hope it helps you. And I hope that hearing that from my detective G, my detective good, because for someone to go the extra mile, it just totally outshines the person who did an injustice to you. Because my brother wasn't just killed once, he was killed twice. Those are my answers. That's how I got those answers. But I'm so grateful for you, Detective G, and if you ever listen to this, you know who you are, and I really appreciate you. And for all of you surviving siblings, just know that don't be forced for closure. I agree. In my opinion, I don't think true closure exists. I think what we're really seeking is answers. So all there really is answers. So get the answers that you really need. And I found that these answers carried me into 2021, but there were just a few more that I needed before I was able to start sharing my journey and my grief journey with you on this podcast. Thank you so much for listening to the Surviving Siblings podcast. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did creating it for you, then share it on your chosen social media platform. And don't forget to tag us at Surviving Siblings Podcast so that more surviving siblings can find us. Remember to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. And don't forget to follow us on all social media platforms. We're on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Surviving Siblings Podcast. All links can be found in the show notes, so be sure to check those out too. Thank you again for the support. Until the next episode, keep on surviving, my surviving siblings.